May 7, 1945, World War II in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered only hours earlier, and American soldiers were celebrating in the streets. But inside a commandeered German mansion outside Frankfurt, one man wasn't celebrating, not even close. General George S. Patton sat across from Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower with a warning that would shatter their friendship, end his career, and echo through history. What Patton said that day was so explosive that Washington called it madness. But he believed it was the truth. We're going to have to fight them eventually. Let's do it now, while we can win. He wasn't talking about the Germans. He was talking about the Soviet Union. This is the story of the moment Patton tried to change the course of history, and the silence that doomed the world to 45 years of Cold War. General George S. Patton had never been a man who hid his opinions, and in the final months of World War II, those opinions became more explosive than any artillery shell under his command. As Europe celebrated the collapse of Nazi Germany, Patton found no comfort in the victory. Instead, he sensed another storm, darker, larger, and far more dangerous gathering on the horizon. To him, the Soviet Union was not a liberating force sweeping across Eastern Europe. It was an expanding empire swallowing nations whole. While American newspapers hailed Stalin as a steadfast ally and politicians toasted to partnership, Patton saw something very different on the ground. Mass executions conducted under the guise of military tribunals. Thousands of civilians deported to gulags deep inside the Soviet interior, and entire towns stripped of resources until nothing remained but hunger and fear. His intelligence officers brought reports that read more like nightmares than briefings. Polish officers disappearing without trace. Czech resistance fighters arrested for the crime of not being sufficiently loyal to Moscow. Romanian villages emptied overnight as families were separated and marched east. These weren't isolated incidents, they formed a pattern, a clear and chilling strategy of domination. Then came the testimonies from American prisoners of war. These were men who had survived German camps only to fall into Soviet custody when the Red Army overran their regions. They didn't return with gratitude. They returned with warnings. Some arrived barefoot, their uniforms traded by Soviet soldiers for food or vodka. Others carried bruises from rifle butts, or told stories of being forced to march for days with little more than frozen bread to keep them alive. Their liberation felt more like another captivity, one with uncertain rules and unpredictable violence. Patton read every report and listened to every testimony, and each one hardened his conclusion: the Soviets were not friends. The Soviets were the next enemy. He believed the Allies stood at a moment of unprecedented strength. American divisions were battle-tested and fully supplied. The British were exhausted but still formidable. Strategic air power, American and British, both dominated the skies in a way no nation had ever achieved before. Patton was convinced that if the West acted quickly, before the Soviets recovered from their enormous wartime losses, they could push the Red Army back behind its own borders. He didn't stop there. In private discussions with fellow officers, he floated a notion that sent shivers through Washington: use surrendered German units, already trained to fight the Red Army, as auxiliary forces under Allied command. They would be re-equipped, reorganized, and thrown back into battle, not to restore Hitlerism, but to prevent Stalinism from sweeping across the continent. To Patton, this wasn't madness. It was strategy. Cold, brutal, necessary, but in Washington his ideas were treated like a threat. The political leadership wanted peace, not another war. Roosevelt was gone, but his administration's policy remained. The Soviets were to be treated as partners in shaping the post-war world. Officially, they were trusted allies. Any suggestion otherwise risked unraveling the delicate agreements made at Yalta and Potsdam, agreements that Patton already believed Moscow had no intention of honoring. So his warnings were dismissed as exaggerations, or worse, as symptoms of stress from too many years of combat command. What the politicians saw as stability, Patton saw as naivety. What they called diplomacy, he called appeasement. And day by day, Soviet forces tightened their grip on Eastern Europe while the West congratulated itself on winning the war. Patton watched it happen with mounting dread. To Washington, the idea of confronting the Soviet Union was unthinkable. To Patton, it was the only logical move, the last chance to prevent a future catastrophe he believed was already unfolding. For Dwight D. Eisenhower, victory in Europe was supposed to mark the end of bloodshed, not the beginning of a new conflict. After 6 brutal years of global war, the world was desperate for calm, stability, and reconstruction. Eisenhower understood that longing better than most. He had carried the weight of millions of Allied soldiers on his shoulders, made decisions that determined the fate of nations, and navigated the fragile egos of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Now, with the guns finally quiet, he was determined not to plunge the world back into chaos. So when General George S. Patton, fiery, brilliant, and utterly uncompromising, presented his proposal to confront the Soviet Union head-on, Eisenhower did not consider it madness. He considered it dangerous. Not militarily, politically, on paper, Patton wasn't wrong. The Western Allies still had enormous armies deployed across Europe. Their supply lines were intact, their morale high, their air forces unrivaled. By contrast, the Soviet Union had taken catastrophic losses. Entire generations had been wiped out. Cities were in ruins. Ammunition stocks were strained. The Red Army was powerful but exhausted. From a purely strategic standpoint, and there was a fleeting window in which an Allied offensive might have forced Stalin to retreat. Eisenhower knew this. His staff knew it. Even the British chiefs of staff entertained similar calculations behind closed doors, but strategy wasn't the only equation. President Truman, newly thrust into power after Roosevelt's sudden death, had inherited a diplomatic framework built on the belief that cooperation with Stalin was not only possible but essential. The American public saw the Soviet leader as Uncle Joe, the gruff but dependable partner who had helped crush Hitler. Newspapers printed sympathetic stories about the sacrifices of the Red Army. Hollywood praised Soviet resilience. The idea of turning on an ally, barely weeks after the fall of Berlin, was politically unthinkable. Eisenhower was no politician. But he understood politics better than Patton ever would. He saw what Patton refused to acknowledge. Any suggestion of attacking the Soviet Union would not merely be dismissed. It would be perceived as treachery. It would shatter morale. It would fracture the Allied coalition. It would destroy Eisenhower's own credibility and likely cost him his career. Patton could say such things because he was a battlefield commander, bold, unfiltered, and beloved by his troops. Eisenhower, however, was the supreme commander of Allied forces. His words shaped policy, diplomacy, and the fragile future of Europe. If he endorsed Patton's plan or even hinted at agreement, it could ignite a political inferno from which none of them would emerge unscathed. Where Patton saw opportunity, a brief moment to check Soviet expansion before it was too late, Eisenhower saw catastrophe. He feared that even preparing contingency plans might provoke Stalin into tightening his grip on Eastern Europe or, worse, launching preemptive actions. The war had barely ended. Millions were displaced. Nations were in ruins. Another conflict could tear what remained of Europe apart. So Eisenhower did what Patton could never bring himself to do. He chose restraint. He chose diplomacy. He chose silence. To Eisenhower, this was responsible leadership, a necessary compromise to prevent the world from tumbling into yet another abyss. He believed time, negotiation, and international institutions would manage the Soviet threat, that rational cooperation would prevail. But to Patton, Eisenhower's silence was nothing less than surrender or betrayal of the very principles they had fought for. He saw Europe being carved up while the Allies stood idle. He saw Eisenhower's diplomacy as naivety, and his caution as weakness. The two men had marched through the same war. But the paths they saw ahead now split in opposite directions. On one side stood Patton, the warrior, the visionary, the man who believed the world must be shaped by decisive action before evil took root again. On the other stood Eisenhower, the diplomat, the stabilizer, the man who feared that one more war would break civilization entirely. Their clash was inevitable, their visions irreconcilable, and in the end, Eisenhower chose silence, a silence that would echo long after the war had ended. General Patton may have felt isolated within the American command, but across the Channel, another mind one shaped by decades of war, politics, and empire was reaching the same chilling conclusion. Winston Churchill, the indomitable British Prime Minister who had spent the entire war warning the world about tyrants, was now sounding an alarm the Allies didn't want to hear. Churchill had watched Soviet behavior with increasing concern as the Red Army marched westward. At first, the alliance with Stalin had been a necessity, a pact with the devil, as Churchill privately described it, but now that Hitler was defeated, the mask was slipping. Churchill saw Eastern Europe being consumed with ruthless efficiency, puppet governments installed overnight, elections falsified, local leaders arrested or executed, and entire populations forced into submission. Churchill didn't merely suspect Soviet intentions. He knew them. He had studied Stalin for decades. He understood Soviet ideology, its hunger for expansion, its willingness to sacrifice millions for control. And he also knew something else, something Patton understood instinctively. Once the Soviets entrenched themselves behind an iron wall of occupied territory, forcing them out would become almost impossible. So, in May 1945, while Allied soldiers were still celebrating V-Day and Europe was still littered with rubble, Churchill made a bold, secret move. He ordered his military planners to design a full-scale war plan against the Soviet Union. Its name was chillingly appropriate. Operation Unthinkable. The objective was direct and uncompromising. Force the Soviet Union back into its borders and restore the freedom of Eastern Europe before Stalin could cement his power. The plan wasn't theoretical. It wasn't an academic exercise. Churchill wanted to know, in clear military terms, whether the West could launch such an operation and whether it could win. British planners studied troop strengths, supply routes, logistics, and geography. They analyzed Red Army movements, Soviet command structure, and the vulnerabilities left after 4 years of brutal warfare. They even considered the controversial option of rearming German divisions, just as Patton had suggested. And the result? They concluded it was militarily possible, but only if the attack happened immediately, within weeks. Not months. The planners warned that if the USSR remained unchallenged, if months turned into years, the Soviet position would harden. Their armies would replenish. Their occupied territories would be fortified. Their political grip would tighten into something permanent. The West had a narrow window, they said, a shrinking opportunity to prevent Soviet domination over half of Europe. Churchill understood the urgency. He understood the cost of hesitation. He had spent the 1930s trying to convince the world to stop Hitler before it was too late. He saw history repeating, and he refused to watch another tyrant carve up the continent while others looked away. But across the Atlantic, President Truman saw something very different. To Truman, Churchill's proposal was dangerous brinksmanship. The American public wanted peace. The army wanted demobilization. Mothers wanted sons to come home. A new war against an ally who had just lost 20 million people was politically and morally unthinkable. So, Truman rejected Operation Unthinkable immediately. No debate, no negotiation. No consideration. Churchill's plan was sealed, classified, and buried. When Patton learned of it, he felt an almost grim satisfaction. Here was one of the most experienced statesmen in the world, one not known for rash decisions, reaching the same conclusion he had. The Soviet Union was not a partner for peace. But the next great threat, someone else saw the storm gathering on the horizon. Someone else understood that the end of one tyranny had only exposed the rise of another. And for Patton, it was vindication unwanted, uncelebrated, and ominous. The future he feared was already taking shape. Patton had spent the war defeating enemies on the battlefield. Now, in the uneasy months after victory, he found himself facing a different kind of enemy, one he could not outmaneuver with tanks or artillery. He faced the American press. The trouble began the moment snippets of Patton's private remarks leaked comments about the Soviets, about the future of Europe, and most controversially about the possible reorganization of surrendered German forces. Patton had spoken bluntly, as he always did. He warned that Soviet aggression was already reshaping the continent. He argued that former Wehrmacht units, now disarmed and languishing in POW camps, might be better used to counter Soviet expansion rather than allowed to wither in captivity. To Patton, this wasn't sympathy for the Germans. It was strategy. To the press, it was scandal. Within days, American newspapers launched what felt like a coordinated assault. Headlines painted Patton as unhinged, reckless, even dangerous. Editorials questioned his judgment, his loyalty, his state of mind. They accused him of wanting to plunge America into another war before the first one had even properly ended. Some columnists went further, implying he harbored a soft spot for the very enemy he had spent years fighting. Time magazine published a particularly stinging critique. It asked whether Patton's battlefield temperament made him unfit for peacetime leadership. They portrayed him as a relic of an older-era warrior incapable of adapting to diplomacy, incapable of understanding the delicate political balancing act required now that the guns had fallen silent. Never mind that Patton had helped liberate Europe. Never mind that his tactics had saved thousands of American lives. Never mind that many of his predictions about Soviet expansion were already beginning to unfold. The narrative had been chosen. And once the media machine began turning, it did not stop. Every comment he made was scrutinized. Every speech branded as provocative. Every warning about Stalin dismissed as paranoia. The same outlets that once hailed him as a hero now mocked him, writing that he was too violent, too volatile, or too obsessed with war to understand peace. The political pressure grew heavier by the week. Eisenhower, meanwhile, found himself trapped between loyalty to an old comrade and loyalty to a fragile post-war diplomatic order. Privately, he respected Patton's strategic brilliance. Publicly, he had to maintain the facade of unity among the Allies, especially with the Soviets. And the Truman administration made it clear that Patton's remarks were becoming a liability, every headline attacking. Patton reflected back on the Army and on Eisenhower's leadership. The press painted Patton as unpredictable. The White House whispered that he was insubordinate. Congress criticized his lack of political understanding. It was a slow, deliberate isolation. Finally, in September 1945, the political pressure reached its breaking point. Eisenhower relieved Patton of command. The official explanation cited controversial public statements and an inappropriate comparison he made between Nazi and Soviet methods of control. But everyone in the military understood the real reason just as clearly as Patton understood it himself. He had refused to stay silent. He had refused to pretend the Soviets were allies in anything but name. He had refused to stop warning that Eastern Europe was being swallowed whole. He had refused to abandon his belief that the West must act now or pay dearly later. For that, the media turned on him. For that, Washington disowned him. For that, he lost his command. It was one of the most decorated generals in American history, brought down not by bullets or bombs, but by headlines, politics, and the price of telling an unwelcome truth. In the end, Patton's warnings were not disproven. They were simply ignored. Patton's removal from command should have silenced him. That, at least, was Washington hoped. But the man who had crossed Europe with tanks and fire in his voice was not about to abandon the fight simply because he had been pushed into a quieter office. Patton believed he had seen the next great threat to the world, and if the U.S. Army would not listen to him from a podium, then he would force them to listen through pen and paper. He began writing letter after letter long, defiant, urgent letters addressed to generals, to political allies, and even to friends back home. Anyone he thought might listen. Anyone who might still understand what was coming. He warned that the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe was not temporary. It was a calculated takeover. He predicted that communist parties, armed, funded, and directed by Moscow, would engineer coups throughout the region. He foresaw that these movements would not stop at Poland or Romania or Czechoslovakia, but would spread into Western Europe, Asia, and beyond. He wrote that the current Allied policy toward Stalin was built on dangerous illusions. He wrote that the Soviet Union respected only one thing, strength. And he wrote a warning that would become one of the most haunting quotes of his life. If we fail to show strength, we have lost the war. Not a war, the war. To Patton, allowing Soviet domination to spread was the same as surrendering everything the Allies had fought for. Victory meant nothing if one tyranny replaced another, but his words fell into the same void as before. Letters went unanswered. Reports were quietly filed away. Warnings were dismissed as the frustrations of a sideline general who couldn't adjust to peacetime. Still, Patton refused to let the truth die in him, and in early December 1945, he delivered what would become his final assessment, a blunt, unfiltered summary of where he believed the world was heading. He predicted the Soviet Union would not leave. Eastern Europe. Communist movements would spread across the globe. Massive geopolitical confrontation between East and West was inevitable. He believed the window to act was closing. He believed no one in Washington grasped the scale of the danger. He believed the next war had already begun in silence. 3 days later, tragedy struck on December 9, 1945. Patton's Cadillac staff car collided with a U.S. Army truck near Mannheim, Germany. The crash was strange enough that historians still debate it nearly a century later. The truck belonged to American soldiers who could not fully explain why it suddenly turned across Patton's path. Every passenger in the Cadillac walked away with minor injuries, except Patton. He was thrown violently forward, fracturing vertebrae in his neck. Paralyzed from the shoulders down, he remained conscious, alert, and fully aware of the severity of his condition. "This is a hell of a way to die," he told his staff 12 days later. On December 21st, he was gone. No proof of foul play ever emerged, but the timing so soon after his warnings fueled decades of speculation. Was it just a tragic accident? Or had a man who knew too much and spoke too loudly become too inconvenient to tolerate? In the absence of answers, only the questions remain. What is certain, however, is what came next. In the years that followed Patton's death, everything he predicted unfolded with chilling precision. The Soviet iron grip on Eastern Europe tightened. Communist coups swept across the region. China fell to communism. The Korean War erupted. The Cold War consumed the world for nearly half a century. Nations armed themselves for nuclear annihilation. The world split into two hostile camps exactly as Patton had warned. He had seen the future. Others had refused to look, and then, inevitably, Patton's warnings came true. The Iron Curtain fell across Europe. Communist regimes seized Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Millions died in purges, camps, and crackdowns. The Cold War spread to Korea, Vietnam, Africa, and Latin America. By the time America finally confronted Soviet expansion, the cost was immense. 45 years, trillions of dollars, countless lives. Patton had argued the decisive moment was May 1945, when America was strongest and the Red Army was exhausted. History proved his warnings right, even if the world rejected them at the time. If you found this story of Patton's final warning powerful, you're in the right place. WWII Rewind dives into the forgotten truths, hidden decisions, and pivotal moments that shaped our world. So, if you want more uncompromising history, subscribe, hit the like button, and ring the bell so you never miss the next chapter, and tell me in the comments, was Patton right? And what would the world look like if America had taken his advice in 1945? History doesn't repeat, but here on WWII Rewind we make sure it never gets forgotten.